Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to participate in this lunchtime lecture series celebrating the 250th anniversary of the foundation of the Armagh Robinson Library. And I wish to thank the director, Dr. Robert Hahn, for his invitation to give an account of their manuscript of Conall Mag Eochagáin's unique Chronicle of Ireland, extending from the biblical Adam all the way to Anno Domini 1408. For this Armagh manuscript has certainly been the most influential and widely referenced of all of the known copies of Conall's book, which work was entitled by Sir James Ware in the mid-17th century as the Annals of Clonmacnoise, and Ware's title has been used very widely ever since then. However, for reasons that I shall explain, I prefer and shall use the title Mag Eochagáin's book, or more briefly, Conall's book. I begin by displaying on this first slide the final lines of this Armagh manuscript and a partial transcription of it below. For this reproduces Conall's signature in the very last line, and it also shows us some important details concerning his work. For it shows that it was written in English, and it gives Conall's very last entry in his Chronicle, which records violence against Miles Dalton and his son in the year 1408. Then in the following line, here endeth this book, written in large printed letters, emphatically ends the Chronicle, and it shows that Conall himself referenced the work as his book. And this is my first reason for preferring the title Mag Eochagáin's book. This is followed by these 5 lines addressed to his brother-in-law, Toirdhealbhach Mac Cochláin, alias Terence MacCoghlan, explaining that he has left some blank pages for an index, which, should Terence be too busy, then he, Conall, would compile it. In the event, neither of them compiled and indexed, and as we shall see, this omission has an important implication for this Armagh manuscript. Conall then concludes here, and so I rest the last of June 1627, yours C.M.G., Conall Mag Eochagáin. Lastly, I would like to draw to your attention that the scribe of this manuscript has framed his text with ruled lines. You see 2 of these ruled lines very clearly here on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, they're not so readily seen, but you can see that they mark the left-hand side of the text. And on the full page, he has corresponding horizontal lines at the top and the bottom, so his text has a frame of ruled lines. We shall see that these framing lines have a particular relevance for this manuscript. So this page shows us that on the 30th of June 1627, Conall Mag Eochagáin completed compiling a chronicle of Irish affairs in English extending to the year 1408 for his brother-in-law. Next, in order to give you a better idea of the typical content of his work, on my next slide I display Conall's account for the Chronicle years 711 to 717. You see here the ruled framing around the marginal years. On the other side, it's been lost in the binding. So this page shows us that on the 30th of regarding his chronicle, at 711, he has there was a shining, an extreme clear night and harvest. At 712, Ceallaigh, king of Leinster, died. Flann, abbot of Armagh, died. Cillian, bishop and abbot of Ferns, died. Mark MacBrian, with a great army, went to Cashel in 713. Osri, son of Alfred, king of the Saxons, was killed. and so forth. Most of the entries record the obits of either ecclesiastical or secular leaders. It was this year-by-year arrangement of the Chronicle that prompted Sir James Ware to entitle the work as Annals. For that word designates a chronicle that systematically records events year by year. However, you will notice that the year 714 is missing, and such omissions are very frequent in the work, so that it is not systematically analytic. This is the second reason that I prefer to use Conall's own term book. On the other hand, vast numbers of these cryptic records of deaths, conflicts, and wonders are to be found in that group of early medieval Gaelic chronicles that are strictly analytic and which are known collectively as the Irish Annals. And we shall see that Conall certainly used these. But first, let me address two important questions relating to Conall himself. First, who was Conall Mag Eochagáin? And second, why did Conall make this English translation? Well, here is a brief account of what we know about him. Conall was a well-educated man of aristocratic family background. His residence was in Lismoyny, County Westmeath, about 4 kilometres east of Clara. He was literate in Gaelic, English, and Latin, and he was widely read in Gaelic history, hagiography, folklore, and genealogy. Conall was in contact with some of the most noted Irish men of learning of his era. For example, Brother Míchéal Ó Cléirigh, the lead compiler of the Annals of the Four Masters, and James Ussher, Archbishop of Armagh, the immensely prolific author of historical and ecclesiastical works. We do not know in what year Conall died, but he certainly flourished through the first four decades of the 17th century until at least 1641. Regarding the circumstances that prompted Conall's translation, he made this explicit in the preface that he wrote for his book, wherein he addressed his brother-in-law, Terence MacCoghlan, in the following affectionate terms. Quote, "To the worthy and of great expectation young gentleman, Mr. Terence MacCoghlan, his brother, Conall Mag Eochagáin, wisheth long health with good success in all his affairs." Then towards the end of his preface, Conall wrote of, quote, "The earnest desire I understand you have to know these things made me undertake the translating of the Old Irish Book for you," end quote. From this it is clear that Terence MacCoghlan was neither literate in Gaelic nor educated in Gaelic history, and that Conall, fond of his younger brother-in-law and holding him in great esteem, was seeking to make a sample of Gaelic history and culture available to him in English. Regarding the sources that Conall used for his book, from the early 5th century onwards, he principally used the Irish Annals, which are annalistic chronicles that were written in Latin and Gaelic in Ireland from the 5th to the late 16th century. And over these 1200 years, they were specifically maintained for by far the longest period in the monastery of Clonmacnoise, where they were kept from the mid-8th to the 13th century. That is, for about 450 years, they were kept in the monastery of Clonmacnoise. The best surviving manuscripts that we have of these Clonmacnoise annals are the Annals of Tigernach from the Bodleian manuscripts Rawlinson B 502 and 488, the earliest of which were written 5 centuries before Conall's book. So to give you the idea of Conall's source for those years 711, I displayed these years from the Annals of Tigernach, preserved in the Bodleian manuscript Rawlinson B 488. Here's the best representative that we have of the annals kept in Clonmacnoise, and these on folio 12 verso include the years corresponding to those from manuscript A for 711 to 717 that we already saw on the second slide. I realize that at this scale you cannot easily examine the text, but I would draw your attention to the fact that these Clonmacnoise Annals had no Anno Domini years. The two faint instances that you may be able to cite in the margin, 714 here and 721 here, were added by Sir James Ware, who owned this manuscript in the 17th century. Instead, the beginning of each year was marked in these annals by an enlarged KL representing the calends or the 1st of January, which I have encircled here in green. So the Clonmacnoise Annals did not supply any Anno Domini, and Conall had to invent these for himself. Next, to show you the relationship between Conall's Chronicle and these Clonmacnoise Annals, in my next slide, I have underlined in red each entry that he translated, and I have also inserted Conall's marginal years in red. So, to begin with the year he labeled 711, he translated the last entry of that year, the last of a long series of entries. The year he labeled 712, he translated the first and the second and the penultimate. The year he labeled 713, he translated the first, the third, and the fifth. The following year, he didn't translate any at all. The following year, he labeled 715, and he translated the last of a long series of entries. The following year, he labeled 716, and again, he translated the last of a long series of entries. The following year, he labeled 717, and he translated the first of a long series of entries. From this, we can see how Conall compiled his chronicle. He normally just translated one or two of the entries from near the beginning or near the end of each year of his source. So Conall's chronicle is just a small sample of the Clonmacnoise Annals, and one in which Conall has systematically replaced the encircled calends with his own marginal year. Conall's book is therefore a very meagre reproduction of the Clonmacnoise Annals, and this is the third reason why I consider that Ware's title, Annals of Clonmacnoise, is not appropriate to Conall's book. So this was how Conall made the English translation for his brother-in-law. He translated an entry or two from some of the years of his annalistic source, and he then provided his own marginal chronology for these entries. Regarding Conall's translation of Gaelic, in Owen O'Curry's splendid book of lectures, published in 1861, still invaluable after almost 2 centuries, O'Curry, a scholar and himself a native speaker of Gaelic, described Conall as, and I quote, a man who seems to have well understood the value of the original Gaelic phraseology and rendered it every justice, end quote. And indeed, when we compare Conall's translations with the corresponding entries in the Clonmacnoise Annals, we do certainly find that Conall reproduced their semantic content faithfully, though sometimes abridged. What then of his marginal years? To examine the accuracy of Conall's chronology, in my next slide, I show an enlarged view of Conall Source for the year 713. Conall assigned the underlying events of this year to 713, but the record of the death of Ossory, son of the Saxon King Alfred, can be independently dated to 716. And then his Obit for Failchu MacDorbéni, which he set at 713. But the Annals of Tigernach supply the chronological information that Fáilchiú died on the 4th calends of September, Sabbatú, that's Saturday, and that identifies that he died in the year 716. So both of these entries independently confirm that this refers to the year 716. When we systematically check Conall's chronology, we find that from 630 to 1022, Conall's marginal years are almost all in arrears by between 2 and 7 years. After 1022, the Annals of Clonmacnoise themselves provide an domini, so the question of Conall supplying it didn't arise. Before 630, he supplied marginal years very sporadically, and they are equally erratic. However, in making these critical observations, it is, I think, appropriate to remind ourselves that Conall made this translation simply for the interest of his brother-in-law. He did not intend it as a work of scholarship, and in his preface he stated specifically that it was, and I quote, "not for the reading of any other curious fellow that would rather carpet my phrase," end quote. Clearly, Conall was aware of its shortcomings, and he did not wish his book to be circulated or to be subjected to the sort of critical examination that I have been conducting. So let me turn from critical examination and instead consider the manuscripts of Conall's book. And here we find that numerous copies of it exist. So it is clear that Conall's wish that his translation be read only by his brother-in-law was not respected. For there exist today 9 complete or fairly complete copies of Conall's book, and 8 of these manuscripts were first studied methodically by Seoirse in her PhD of 1980 and her subsequent Royal Irish Academy publication of 1982. In the latter, she identified that this Armagh manuscript was the oldest copy by 1 year, written in 1660, and that 6 other copies had been transcribed partially or fully either from it or its descendants. She represented this with the following family tree. She started here at the top with Conall's book, which she termed his holograph, written in 1627. She identified the first surviving extracts from that were made by Sir James Ware circa 1650, and 2 brief collections of those survive in the British Library. The first full copy was our Armagh manuscript made in 1660, which I refer to as manuscript A. From that, the following year, 1661, a copy was made now in the British Library, manuscript 4817, which I will refer to as manuscript B. 24 years later, a full copy of the Armagh manuscript was made, now in Trinity College, Dublin, manuscript 673. And about a decade after that, that was copied, which manuscript is now in the National Library of Ireland, manuscript 919. And then Sunderland identified that another copy was made from Conall's book, which is now in the National Library of Ireland, manuscript 767. The first scribe used Conall's book, and then the second and third scribe used manuscript A to supplement and to correct the work of the first scribe. And that's the reason for that dotted line there. That work was made somewhere in the middle of the 18th century. Following that, there were 3 copies made, 2 of them in the Royal Irish Academy and a third one in the Library of Maynooth. And as well, because the Armagh manuscript had lost some pages, some of the pages from this manuscript were copied and brought to Maynooth. So that's the reason for this entry here. Those pages are now with manuscript A in Armagh. From this you can see that all of these later copies derive in some degree from manuscript A, and so it has been by far the most influential copy of Conall's book. In her study, while Sanderland precisely dated both manuscript A and manuscript B, and she identified that the scribe of manuscript B was Donal O'Sullivan of Tralee, she did not identify the scribe of manuscript A. And this had the unfortunate consequence for me that in 2008, when I published a discussion of Conall's book, I stated that the scribe of manuscript A was unidentified, which was at the time indeed the case. And as a result, I mistakenly chose rather to emphasize manuscript B. However, subsequently, when I had an opportunity to examine both manuscript A and manuscript B more extensively, I realized that manuscript A had also been written by Donal O'Sullivan, the scribe of manuscript B. To see this, let us compare the following two parallel passages. Here I show the years 657 and 658 from manuscript A above and from manuscript B below. And I would first draw to your attention that on the left, they both have rectilinear frame around their marginal years and marginalia. Those in manuscript B are more widely spaced than those in manuscript A. And similarly, they both have framing lines around their main text. Secondly, in order to compare their handwriting, I would ask you first to examine the numerals of the numbers 657 and 658 here in manuscript A with those in 657 and 658, and you will see that they are virtually identical. Secondly, I would ask you to compare the Gaelic marginalia here, Soron, O, he, Soroin, and below Soron, O, he, Soroin. Here, the script is bigger because there's more space, but you will see that the letters are virtually identical in shape. Thirdly, I would ask you to compare the capitalized words that I have underlined in yellow. Comeen, Armagh, Mag Eochagáin. Comeen, Armagh, Mag Eochagáin. And you will see that they are virtually identical. However, you can also see that the two manuscripts are not identical completely. So consider, for example, this entry here. Comeen Abbott came to Ireland this year. That's very easily read. Now go and read the same entry in manuscript A. Comeen Abbott, that's easily read, but came to Ireland this year. The script is suddenly smaller. No, the scribe has cramped his script in order to try and fit it in to the remainder of the line, and he hasn't quite succeeded. And you can see another instance above and instances below. Well, these observations led me to the following conclusions. I was obliged to conclude that Donal O'Sullivan wrote both manuscript A and manuscript B, but Donal wrote manuscript A quickly, making use of almost all of the available paper and cramping his script in order to fill the ends of his lines. So manuscript A is a copy written for the use of an impecunious scholar. On the other hand, Donald B. wrote manuscript B slowly and carefully, commencing an entry on a new line rather than cramp his script, and consequently leaving large areas of the page blank. So, manuscript B is a prestige copy written for a wealthy client. But who in 1661 could have sought such a prestigious copy of Conall's book? Well, there are marginal annotations in manuscript B, but almost all of them are difficult to identify, with only one exception, as I display on my next slide. Here on folio 87 verso, Conall's apparent marginal year of 990 for the beginning of Brian Boru's reign has been confidently corrected to 996, as I've underlined here in red. And this correction is unmistakably in the hand of Sir James Ware. From this and other considerations, I was compelled to conclude that Donald O'Sullivan had written manuscript B for Sir James Ware following Ware's return to Ireland in 1660 after 10 years in exile, when he was able to resume his Irish historical researches. Sir James Ware was immensely successful as both a politician and as a scholar, and his scholarly accomplishments included the publication of at least a dozen books on Irish history. In fact, as already mentioned, a decade earlier, Ware had copied some of the entries from Conall's book, for Ware took a very close interest in the Irish Annals and collected many of their most important manuscripts. I have already mentioned that Ware owned the Bodleian manuscript of the Annals of Tigernach. However, like Terence MacCoghlan, Ware was not literate in Gaelic, so one can understand that he would take a particular interest in Conall's English translation of Annals and seek his own copy of the work. Further, the fact that a scholar of Sir James Ware's achievements requested Donald O'Sullivan to make a copy of manuscript A is surely a measure of Ware's respect for both manuscript A and for Donald O'Sullivan's ability as a scribe. This, I suggest, is the reason why O'Sullivan took such care in the writing of manuscript B. I next turn to consider the use of manuscript A by other scholars, for Ware was not the only scholar who sought to access and to use manuscript A. Rather, the evidence shows that it has been repeatedly and intensively used over the last 360 years. This is most readily seen in the numerous annotations which have been added to the manuscript, and Sarah Sanderland documented at least 5 different hands for these, and they often sought to correct Conall's erratic chronology. For example, on folio 31 verso, 2 such corrections have been made, which I reproduce on this next slide. The first annotating hand here, which I have outlined in blue at the top, Sanderland labeled L2, and this marginal annotation is referring to the Battle of Alun that Conall had set at the year 720, which you can see immediately above, but which L2 corrected, writing 722, Friday, 11th December. The most prominent corrector was the Connacht Gaelic scholar Ruairi O'Flaherty, alias Roderick O'Flaherty, who inserted numerous chronological corrections or comments. Here, O'Flaherty followed L2, and I have outlined his marginal annotation in red and transcribed it below, in which O'Flaherty, observing that Conall had set Egbert's death at Easter 726, corrected this to the year 729 and directed that subsequent years should be incremented by 3, writing, hence add 3 as 726 Egbert's death at Easter, which 726 should be 729. End quote. This marginal annotation is typical of O'Flaherty's chronological interest and his corrections. Well, as mentioned already, there were at least 5 annotators of manuscript A, and this is one measure of the interest that scholars have taken in the manuscript. Another indication of scholarly interest, but one with unfortunate consequences, is that a number of folios are now missing from the manuscript, so that its chronicle years 778 to 904 are all lost, as is the preface and the index written by Donal Ó Cléirigh in 660 when he wrote the manuscript. It was the loss of these items that prevented Seoirse Andolan from identifying the scribe of manuscript A, because Donal Ó Cléirigh signed the preface. In order to underline for you the important role that manuscript A has played, let me summarize on my next slide the occasions when manuscript A has served, either directly or indirectly, as the exemplar for scholars making a copy of Conall's book. In 1661, Donal Ó Cléirigh copied manuscript A to manuscript B. In 1685, the scribe Tygo Doyle used it as his exemplar when he wrote the copy now Trinity College manuscript 673. Since O'Doherty transcribed the corrections made by L2 and O'Flaherty, these had been made before 1685. Then in the mid-18th century, circa 1740, the second and third scribes of National Library manuscript 767 used manuscript A as their source to supplement and correct the work of the first scribe. Then at the end of the 19th century, Dennis Murphy published the first printed edition of Conall's book in 1896, and in his preface, Murphy acknowledged O'Doherty's copy as his principal source. So Murphy's printed edition is an indirect copy of manuscript A. Finally, in our own time, Nollaig Ó Maríola has used manuscript A as the primary authority for his comprehensive and authoritative edition of Conall's book, and for this he has also critically compared manuscript A with manuscript B and other manuscripts. So you may see from these instances that manuscript A has been repeatedly read, annotated, and transcribed by scholars over the last 3.5 centuries. It is undoubtedly the most important surviving copy of Conall's book. However, that said, it is interesting to make a comparison of manuscript A and manuscript B with the other manuscript that Seoirse Andolan identified as originating from Conall's holograph. So let me return briefly to her stemma. You will recall that Andolan identified that the first scribe of National Library manuscript 767 had used Conall's book, and the second and third scribe used manuscript A to supplement and to correct the work of the first scribe. Well, my recent examination of the first scribe's contribution to manuscript 767 has revealed some very interesting features that I would like to share with you as follows. Here is the very first page written by the first scribe of this manuscript, and you can see that he wrote all of the main text here without framing, with a clear, confident, flowing, beautifully clear hand in a light brown ink, and that is all that the first scribe wrote. The heading above and the 3 marginal items here in the left-hand margin, these three lines written in Gaelic, and these 4 words written in Gaelic, and these 4 lines written in Latin, were all written by the second scribe using different ink and they were all transcribed from manuscript A. In particular, this Latin entry here, which is a correction taken from Julius Scaliger's work on chronology, correcting Conall's date for the destruction of Troy, was written, pardon me, by Rory O'Flaherty into the margin of manuscript A. So there can be no question, but these items were transcribed from manuscript A. And indeed, these features continue through the 550 odd pages of the manuscript. So examination of the first scribe's contribution discloses that, and I've tabulated this, first, he did not draw rectilinear framing. Second, he did not transcribe any page headings. And third, he wrote virtually no marginalia in Gaelic. On the other hand, when we examine manuscript A, we find framing above and down the side. We find headings framed at the head of each page, and we find frequent Gaelic marginalia. Regarding the Gaelic marginalia, these in particular are incongruent with Conall's undertaking to provide an English translation for his brother-in-law. The absence from National Library manuscript 767 of these elements suggested to me that they are in fact additions to Conall's book, as my next slide indicates. In order to clearly identify these additions, I have highlighted here the rectilinear framing in yellow, the page heading above in red, and the two Gaelic marginalia in the left-hand column in green. And below, I transcribe a passage from Donal O'Sullivan's own preface, which survives in both manuscript B and in O'Dowley's copy of manuscript A, in which Donal identified his contribution of both the index and the marginalia. Donal wrote, quote, "I have inconfusedly and immutably transcribed his, that is Conall's work, only the augmenting of some marginals for your good, and the compiling of a confused, yet according to the page, somewhat orderly index, importunity preventing it from being alphabetical," end quote. So here, Donal explicitly acknowledged that he compiled and added the index, and that he also added marginalia to the work. This index survives only in manuscript B, and it consists of these page headings, systematically tabulated against the folio number, which you may be able to see here. And these are transcribed in serial order. So it unmistakably derives from these page headings and folio numbers, and corresponds with Donal's account of his compilation according to the page somewhat orderly index. From this, I was obliged to conclude that Donal O'Sullivan was responsible for the addition of the rectilinear framing and page headings of manuscript A, and when I considered its marginalia, that Donal was also responsible for most of the Gaelic marginalia. Regarding the rectilinear framing, running page headings in the marginalia, it is the case that all of these features had been introduced into European printed editions of chronicles during the 16th century, and by the early 17th century, they were standard practice. Consider, for example, this is a chronicle published in 1613 by the Scottish Jesuit scholar James Gordon. Observe particularly the emphatic rectilinear framing with separate vertical panels on the left hand for his chronicle years. Here the chronicle years, here the regnal years, here the Marginalia, here the main text framed, and here above the running heading framed alongside the page number. These features were the norms of printed chronicles at least 50 years before Donal O'Sullivan transcribed Conall's book in 1660. Consequently, I judge that Donal introduced both rectilinear framing and page headings, and he augmented the marginalia in order to bring his copy of Conall's book into line with the contemporaneous printed book standards, and also to facilitate his construction of the index. Regarding his introduction of marginalia in Gaelic, I noticed that Donal O'Sullivan recorded the progress of his writing of both manuscript A and manuscript B, with marginalia written in Gaelic. That said, I should also emphasize that these features added by Donal represent a very small percentage of the textual content of the whole volume, and moreover, they are readily identifiable. So that manuscript A certainly remains as our best witness to Conall's book, and Nolligo Marilla's forthcoming edition our most authoritative account of it. This brings me to the end of my lecture, and so my next slide summarizes some of my conclusions. In 1627, Conall Mag Eochagáin translated a sample of the Clonmacnoise Annals into English and supplied approximate marginal years, intending it only for the interest of his brother-in-law, Terence MacCoghlan. In circa 1650, Sir James Ware made extracts from Conall's book. In 1660, Donal O'Sullivan transcribed the book, upgrading its format to correspond with the style of printed chronicles to give manuscript A. In 1661, Donal O'Sullivan made a prestigious copy of manuscript A for Sir James Ware, and this is manuscript B. By 1685, numerous corrections had been annotated in manuscript A, which were all transcribed by Tygo Dawley into what is now Trinity College Dublin manuscript 673. Finally, Conall Mag Eochagáin did not wish his book to be circulated, but as Gaelic scholarship and culture were obliterated in the 17th century and Anglophone scholarship triumphed, so the demand for Conall's English translation grew, and Donal O'Sullivan responded accordingly. Finally, I give a short list of suggested further reading for anyone who wishes to explore the subject further, which list I understand will remain on the Armagh Robinson website. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, and should you have any questions arising, then I shall be happy to respond to them.